I still remember the sound of my father's workshop door when it closed, this soft old wood sigh that echoed through the house like a warning and a comfort at the same time. I must have been 12 the first time I heard it late at night, long after he was supposed to be sleeping. Curious, I tiptoed down the stairs, careful not to step on the board that creaked near the railing, and peeked through the narrow opening. He sat there hunched over his desk, the yellow lamplight painting half his face in gold and leaving the other half swallowed in shadow. Papers everywhere, ledgers, contracts. His calloused fingers rubbing his temples while he whispered to himself, "I hope they understand one day." I didn't know who they were at the time. Maybe I didn't want to know. But that memory came back to me with brutal clarity the moment my younger brother sat across from me in the mediation room, leaned forward as if he were claiming something he had bled for, and said, "I want half of the company." The air left my lungs so fast I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I suddenly understood that some stories don't break your heart all at once. They take their time. They show you the fracture, then the widening, then the collapse. And before you realize it, the ground beneath you has been giving way for years. Maybe that's why, even before I opened my mouth to respond, I felt my father's old workshop drifting back into the present. The lamplight, the shadows, the weight. Maybe I understood in that precise moment that this wasn't just a legal conflict. This was the culmination of something that began long before either de nos percebu. I looked at my brother. Really looked. His jaw was tense, the kind of tension that comes from years of believing you've been overlooked. His eyes were cold but trembling at the edges, as if the anger was only the outer shell of something much more fragile. And for a second, for the briefest heartbeat, I wondered, when did we stop being brothers and start being opponents? When did the line shift without either of us noticing? Does every family carry a moment like this, an invisible turning point that no one wants to admit happened? Those questions cut deeper than his demand. The mediator cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses with a detached professionalism that didn't match the storm tightening my chest. The windows behind him were covered with frosted film, blurring the shapes of people walking outside. Life continued on the other side of that glass, unaware that inside this room, the last threads of my family were stretching to the edge of tearing. "Mr. Thomas," the mediator said softly, "your brother is requesting a 50% division of ownership. Before we proceed, do you want to respond?" Respond. As if a request like that were just a line on a form. As if it wasn't a blade pointed directly at everything I had built since the day our father handed me the keys. I wanted to tell him about the nights I slept on the office floor, the clients I fought tooth and nail to win, the way my hands shook the first time a payroll deadline landed, and I didn't have enough in the account. I wanted to remind him of the years he disappeared into impulsive ventures while I stayed, holding the weight he didn't even acknowledge existed. But instead I found myself thinking about something else entirely. The promise, the one my father made me give him on that last evening in the hospital, when his breath was already shallow and his hands were cool against mine. He squeezed my fingers with surprising strength and whispered, "Don't let him destroy himself trying to compete with you." At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. I thought he was delirious. Shouldn't he have told my brother something like that? Why put the burden on me? Now I knew. Now it echoed so loudly inside me, it felt like prophecy. As the silence stretched, my brother smirked, as if he mistook my hesitation for weakness. "I deserve it," he said. "Dad would never want me left out." The irony nearly choked me. And yet, beneath the anger was something else. A sorrow so old it tasted metallic, like blood in the back of the throat. Because no matter how wrong he was, no matter how unreasonable, he was still the boy who used to follow me around the backyard with a stick, pretending it was a sword. The boy who cried the day I left for college because he thought going away meant leaving him forever. How does love turn into this? How does time twist familiar faces into strangers? I took a breath, deep and steadying, and looked around the mediation room, absorbing every detail. The scuffed edge of the table, the humming vent above us, the faint smell of disinfectant. I wanted to record the scene in my memory the same way I recorded that night in the workshop. Both moments carried the same kind of weight, the feeling that life was about to split in two. Because here is the truth I didn't want to admit, but felt rising inside me like a tide. This wasn't a story about money. This was a story about inheritance, but not the kind you can divide on paper. This was about the things fathers leave behind that don't fit in envelopes or safes. guilt, expectations, silence, love that never found the right language, and the seeds of rivalries that grow in the dark. And I realized, with a sudden jolt of clarity, that one way or another this day would reveal something about who I truly was, not as a businessman, not as the eldest son, but as a man who had carried a responsibility he never asked for. I straightened my posture, feeling a strange calm settle over me. Before I responded, a part of me wanted to reach through the invisible wall between us to ask him, "Why are you really doing this? What are you afraid of? What did you go through that I didn't see?" But some questions don't survive the world once they leave your mouth. Some truths need slower hands. So I said nothing, not yet. I simply opened my briefcase, feeling the weight shift, the hinge creak, and allowed the memories of my father's workshop to guide my fingers. The paper inside felt warmer than it should have, as if carrying its own pulse. My brother noticed the movement. His eyes flickered with suspicion. "What is that?" he asked. I didn't answer, because the moment before a secret is revealed is its own kind of universe. Silent, trembling, heavy enough to bend the air around it. And in that suspended breath, I felt the shape of what this story would become. A journey into the fault lines of our childhood. A confrontation with the truth our father hid. A reckoning with the kind of love that wounds before it heals. And maybe, if we were lucky, a small flickering chance of rebuilding what we lost. But we weren't at the rebuilding part yet. We were still in the room where everything cracked. And before I turned another page of my family's history, I let myself speak directly to the people who would eventually hear this story. If stories like this make you reflect too, subscribe. It's how we keep finding each other here. As the sentence lingered inside me, I lifted the envelope my father left behind, and everything in the room changed. I didn't open the letter right away. I let my fingers rest on the paper for a moment, feeling the ridges, the faint texture of something handled by a man who had been gone for years. It's strange how an object can hold temperature, even after the hands that warmed it no longer exist. The room felt suddenly too quiet, like the air was waiting for me to make a choice I'd postponed since the day the letter was slipped into my palm, with a whisper I didn't yet understand. My brother watched me with a mix of suspicion and fear, the kind of fear that comes from not knowing whether the truth will liberate you or expose you. I recognized that fear because it lived inside me too, tucked beneath layers of logic and responsibility, and all the roles I had accepted without being asked. For most of my life, I believed my job was simple. Hold everything together. Hold the family. Hold the company. Hold my brother when he stumbled, so he didn't fall too hard. Hold my father's expectations, even when they felt heavier than anything a young man should carry. What I never admitted, not even to myself, was that somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking about what I wanted. I became the scaffolding of my own life, always supporting, never leaning. And when you spend enough time being the one who holds, you begin to fear what will happen if you let go, even for a second. That was the real reason my hands trembled as I unfolded the letter. Not because I feared losing the company, but because I feared what the truth inside that envelope would demand of me, and what it would reveal about the cracks I'd never allowed to show. As the paper opened, a faint scent rose, old wood, and something like dust warmed by sunlight. My father had kept this letter in his desk drawer, the one he locked every night as if he believed some secrets needed protection. I used to hear him open that drawer in the early mornings when he thought no one was awake. Perhaps this letter was in his hands during those dawn hours when he wrestled with things he never found the words to say aloud. I began to read. The first lines were simple, almost gentle, but beneath them I felt the weight of truths he had held too tightly. My son, if this letter has reached you, then something I feared has come to pass. I paused, swallowing hard. That sentence alone was enough to bring back 1,000 memories I wished I could reshape. My father standing between us when we argued, my father taking my brother aside when he got into trouble, my father silently putting the pieces back together when my brother broke something out of anger, pride, or confusion. In my childhood mind, it looked like favoritism. In my adult mind, it sometimes felt like betrayal. In truth, it was neither. It was a man trying desperately to raise 2 sons while fighting battles we never saw. I loved you both, but I did not love you the same way. Not because of worth, but because of need. Need. That word hit deeper than I expected. I had spent my whole life believing love that wasn't equal wasn't real, But maybe I was the one who misunderstood what balance meant. Sometimes one child needs discipline, the other needs reassurance. Sometimes one needs structure, the other needs space. And sometimes one child needs to be prepared for burdens the other will not carry. My throat tightened as I continued. You were the one I trusted with the things I could not fix. You inherited my strength, my stubbornness, and my silence. And because of that, I gave you more than I admitted. Silence. There it was again. The inheritance no one talks about. The one that burrows into your bones and becomes a second skin. I had inherited his silence, but I also inherited the belief that emotions were luxuries we could not afford. That admitting pain was the first step toward losing control. That weakness had no place in the life of the son who was meant to hold everything together. But the letter didn't end with me. It turned toward my brother with a tenderness I didn't expect. Your brother, he suffered in ways I didn't see quickly enough. He carried my disappointment the way you carried my expectations. Both were weights I placed on you unfairly. My breath caught. My brother wasn't looking at me anymore. He was staring at the table, his hands still but tense, as if he were bracing himself against a truth that threatened the only version of our childhood he had managed to survive. I kept reading, my voice shaking. He never competed with you. He competed with the image of you that I unknowingly created. I am asking you, do not punish him for a shadow I cast. And just like that, something inside me cracked in a way I wasn't ready for, because I realized that for all these years, my brother wasn't fighting me. He was fighting the ghost of a son my father praised too loudly, expected too much from, and relied on too deeply. A ghost I didn't choose to become. I felt a hollowness inside me, not empty, but spacious, like a room that had been sealed for years, suddenly receiving fresh air. The letter went on, addressing the company, the inheritance, the practical matters, but I barely registered those parts. My eyes blurred at a sentence that reached inside and pulled out something I didn't know was still alive in me. If he asks for half, remind him it is not because he deserves half of what you built, but because he deserves half of your patience, half of your forgiveness, and half of your heart. I swallowed, my chest tight. Was I capable of that? Had I been holding everything together for so long that I forgot how to let anything in? The last line of the letter was simple. Tell him I loved him, even when I failed. When I finished reading, the room felt heavier, yet clearer. My brother's eyes glistened, but he didn't wipe the tears. He didn't hide them either. And something about that vulnerability, raw, unguarded, almost childlike, made my anger dissolve into something quieter, sadder, more human. Because in that moment I saw him not as a man demanding half of my life's work, but as the boy I used to protect, the boy who always wanted our father to look at him the way he looked at me, the boy who never understood why love felt uneven. I folded the letter slowly, gently, as if closing it too quickly might erase the truth it carried. I didn't know, my brother whispered. I know, I replied, and I meant it. What neither of us said, what neither of us could say yet, was that this letter didn't end anything. It didn't solve the fight or close the wound. It simply exposed the root beneath it all. The grief, the jealousy, the silence, the losses we never admitted we felt, and the love that never found the right shape. For the first time in years, I wasn't sure whether we were breaking apart or finally breaking open, but I knew part 2 of this story wasn't about the company. It was about the 2 boys we used to be, suddenly forced to look at the man who raised us and the cracks he left behind. The mediator shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat, reminding us the world was still turning, still waiting for answers. But I didn't rush. Some truths aren't meant to be processed quickly. Some truths need time to settle, like dust in a beam of light, showing you shapes you never saw before. And as I held the letter in my lap, I realized something quietly devastating. This wasn't the moment I lost my brother. This was the moment I realized I never truly knew him. And the hardest part, he didn't truly know me either. The mediator's office had already begun to empty out by the time he pulled open the bottom drawer of his cabinet, the wooden panels scraping softly, as if they too resented being part of this unraveling. The light outside had shifted into that late afternoon gold that always made me think of endings, of seasons closing, of doors that didn't fully shut, of twilight settling over things we should have said earlier. When he lifted the sealed envelope, that same gold light caught the wax, making it shine like something sacred and forgotten. My brother and I both froze. It wasn't just an envelope. It was a weight. A message from a man who had lived between restraint and regret. A man who never said more than he believed necessary. If he left something sealed, it meant he understood we would reach a moment where only the truth could stop us from destroying each other. "Your father left instructions," the mediator said quietly. "This was to be given to both of you, only when you stood on opposite sides." Opposite sides. The phrase hit deep, like a truth I didn't want to acknowledge. Had we really become that? Have you ever felt that moment when you suddenly see yourself from the outside and the reflection hurts more than the reality itself? I reached for the envelope, and my brother shifted slightly. Not closer, not farther, just enough for me to realize a part of him wanted to know and another part feared what knowing would do. For a second, I almost felt something like the old version of us, sitting on the living room carpet, opening birthday cards together, while Dad stood in the kitchen pretending not to watch us. But that was years ago, and innocence is something you only recognize in hindsight. The wax cracked softly when I broke the seal, like a sigh escaping from years of confinement. Inside there was a letter, longer than the first, and 2 photographs. The edges of the photos were worn, as if someone had held them too many times. I slipped them out and felt the world tilt a little. The first photo was of me and my father at the ribbon cutting of the company's first building. I remembered that day far too well. The crisp smell of new paint, the way Dad rested his hand on my shoulder, as if anchoring me to something larger than both of us. I had been proud, terrified, hopeful, and unaware of how much that moment would cost me later. The second photo, I hesitated before showing it to my brother. It was him at 15, standing in the driveway with a half-ripped school certificate in his hand. Dad's arm around him, both of them looking caught between disappointment and forgiveness. The sunlight behind them made the scene almost tender, but all I could feel was the heaviness of an old memory pressing against my ribs. "You remember this?" I asked quietly. My brother swallowed hard. "No, Dad never showed me that picture." Isn't it strange how the things meant to protect us are often the things kept hidden from us? Have you ever looked at a memory and realized it belonged to a version of you that never got the chance to speak? I unfolded the letter slowly. The handwriting was unmistakably his. Firm strokes, deliberate spacing, the marks of a man who believed clarity was the greatest kindness he could offer, even when he withheld it. "My sons," it began, "if you are reading this, then something inevitable has finally happened. I feared it. I tried to prevent it. But life has its own way of teaching what we refuse to learn." I paused, letting the words settle between us. My brother's posture changed. It softened almost imperceptibly. He didn't look angry or defensive anymore. He looked tired, as if the fight he had brought into the room had been borrowed, not born from his own truth. "You both carried weights you did not deserve. One carried my expectations, the other carried my disappointment, and I failed to understand that both burdens are equally cruel." For a moment, my breath vanished. I felt my chest constrict, not from pain, but from recognition, an ache that had been waiting for years to be named. You know when life hands you a sentence that feels like it finally explains something you couldn't articulate, but always felt pulsing beneath your skin. Have you ever lived through that? I kept reading. "Your brother longed for my approval in a way he never had the words for, and you, my eldest, became the man I leaned on when I should have leaned on myself. I shaped you into someone who solved problems that were not yours to solve." The room blurred for a second. I blinked, grounding myself. I had spent years believing I was strong because I carried everything. But maybe strength isn't about carrying. Maybe it's about choosing what to let go of. And I had never learned how to choose. If the day comes when he demands what is not his, understand, he is not asking for the company. He is asking for proof that he is not the lesser son. My brother let out a shaky breath, one that sounded like a confession trying to escape his body. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. The truth was written across his face. "Is that true?" I asked softly. He hesitated, then nodded just once. That single nod felt heavier than anything he had ever said to me. Isn't it unsettling when someone you thought you knew reveals a version of themselves you never imagined? Have you ever had a moment like that, where a person's silence tells you more than their words ever could? The letter continued. "This company belongs to the one who bled for it. I made that choice long before I realized the price it would require of you, but I also leave this truth behind. Love is not measured by what is divided, but by what is understood." I read that line twice, 3 times, maybe more. Understanding. The one thing we never gave each other. The mediator stood very still, watching us as if afraid to break the fragile balance forming in that room. My brother rubbed his thumb along the edge of the table, a nervous habit he had since childhood. I suddenly remembered him doing that on the first day of high school, when he was terrified he wouldn't fit in. It was strange how memories could return with the precision of a photograph, sharp, unexpected, and filled with a meaning that had been invisible back then. The last lines of the letter read, "You are both more than what I made you carry. When the past rises, do not fight each other. Fight the silence that kept you apart. I love you both, in my own imperfect way." I folded the letter with trembling hands, feeling something inside me shift, something that wasn't forgiveness yet, but maybe the beginning of it. My brother looked at me, his eyes glassy, his breath heavy, and for the first time in years, I didn't see him through the lens of responsibility or disappointment. I saw him as a man who had been waiting his whole life for someone to tell him he wasn't the lesser anything. "Why didn't he tell us this when he was alive?" my brother whispered. I didn't answer, because the truth was painful. Our father didn't know how. Some men love in silence because they never learned any other language. Have you ever realized too late that someone loved you the only way they knew how, even if that way hurt you? We sat there for a long time, not speaking, listening to the muffled sounds of the offices shutting down for the night. It felt like being suspended in a memory that didn't belong to the past or the present, something in between, a crossroads we didn't know how to navigate yet. When we finally stood, the golden light outside had turned to dusk. Shadows stretched across the hallway like reminders of everything we still hadn't said, and as we walked side by side toward the door, I realized something that unsettled me deeply. This wasn't the end of our conflict. This was the beginning of the truth. The hallway outside the mediation room felt impossibly long, the kind of hallway where every footstep sounds louder than it should, as if the walls themselves are listening. The carpet was a muted grey, and yet the colors around me seemed distorted, too bright in some places, too faded in others, like reality hadn't fully settled after the truth we had just opened together. My brother walked a step behind me, his breathing uneven, and I could feel the weight of something unsaid pulsing between us, almost like a second presence. When we reached the parking lot, the late evening air hit me with a sudden coolness. The sun was slipping behind the buildings, painting the windows with streaks of orange that made everything look softer, blurred at the edges. There's something about twilight that has always made me feel exposed, like the world is shifting from what it pretends to be into what it really is. And in that moment, I felt that shift inside myself too, quiet, unsettling, promising. We stood there, not speaking at first. Cars passed in the distance, a distant siren echoed somewhere far off, and a single leaf slid across the pavement, making a whisper of a sound that felt louder than any voice. It amazed me how silence can sometimes feel like pressure, like an invisible hand pressing against your chest. Then my brother exhaled sharply, as if gathering the courage to speak. "Can I ask you something?" he said, without looking at me. His voice wasn't challenging anymore. It wasn't defensive. It was raw in a way I hadn't heard since we were kids, and he came into my room after a nightmare, pretending he just couldn't sleep. "Yes," I said. He hesitated, shoulders tight, eyes fixed on the asphalt. "Why didn't you ever give up on me?" The question landed with a kind of quiet violence. I wasn't prepared for it, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I didn't realize he had been carrying it for so long. A lifetime of misunderstandings wrapped inside 8 words. The smallest details around us suddenly sharpened. The faint vibration of a street lamp warming up, the cool scent of rain from earlier in the day still hanging in the air, the way a dog barked 2 blocks away and then fell silent. My heart beat once, twice louder than the rest of the world. Why didn't I give up? I opened my mouth, but no words came. Instead, I felt an old memory rise without warning. Him at 7 years old running across the backyard with his shoelaces untied, determined to keep up with me even though his legs were shorter, his steps clumsier. He fell, hard, and scraped his knee open. Blood pooled fast. He looked at me before he cried, always before, as if waiting to know whether it was okay to hurt. That's when it began, I think, the silent contract that I would stay, that I would hold what he couldn't name. When I finally spoke, my voice felt older than I remembered. "Because you were my brother before you were anything else, before responsibilities, before mistakes, before we became men who forgot how to talk. He closed his eyes for a second, and I saw his shoulders soften just a fraction, not enough to call peace, but enough to call truth. The wind picked up, brushing past us with a cool hum that felt almost like a presence. I don't know if you've ever felt that moment when the world holds still, not because it's peaceful, but because something inside you is shifting into place, like a bone finally aligning after years of being displaced. But that's what it felt like. A painful correction. I always thought Dad loved you more, he whispered. I always thought you belonged to him in a way I didn't. And there it was, the shadow he had been fighting all his life. Not me. Never me. Just the ghost our father accidentally created. The sky dimmed further, the last rays of light sinking behind the horizon. Something about the darkness settling made everything more honest, as if nighttime had been waiting for this confession. He didn't love me more, I said softly. He relied on me more. That's different. And it's not a gift. It's a burden. A silence followed, thick and heavy, but not suffocating. A silence that wanted to heal, not hide. My brother slowly lifted his gaze, and it was the first time in years that I saw him. Not the man who disappointed me, not the boy who needed rescuing, but the human being beneath both. A person who had loved poorly because he had been loved imperfectly. Do you ever wish you hadn't carried all of it, he asked? That Dad didn't put everything on you? I didn't have to think long. Every day. The honesty surprised even me. The air seemed to tighten around us. The hum of traffic softened until it was almost a lullaby. For a moment I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. A small, quiet grief for the life I could have had if I hadn't spent so much time being the glue of a family that kept cracking. I thought of the nights I stayed late at the company, the weekends I cancelled plans, the dreams I postponed so my brother wouldn't fall apart alone. And suddenly a truth surfaced, one I had avoided my entire adult life. I wasn't strong because I chose to be. I was strong because there was no space for me to break. The realization hit with a strange mix of relief and sorrow. It felt like mourning a version of myself I never got to meet. My brother must have felt the shift, because he took one hesitant step closer. Just one, but it mattered. I'm sorry, he said, voice cracking on the last word. For all of it. For making you carry what wasn't yours, for not seeing you. If an apology can have weight, his dropped straight into me, loosening something I didn't know was clenched so tightly. A street lamp flickered on overhead, buzzing softly. The light cast a pale glow on us. Two figures in a half-empty parking lot, standing in the open air with the truth finally between us, instead of buried beneath us. I don't know why, but the sound of the lamp felt like a kind of transition, the universe marking the moment with its own unremarkable ceremony. And then something unexpected happened. Something small, almost imperceptible, but profound enough to change everything. For the first time in years, my brother didn't look at me with rivalry. He looked at me with recognition. Not admiration, not resentment, recognition. As if he was finally seeing not the ghost of our father's ideal, but the man who had been standing in front of him all along, tired, flawed, and trying. The moment stretched, delicate and fragile, like thin glass resting on the edge of a table. One wrong move and it could all shatter, but neither of us moved. In that suspended silence, surrounded by fading daylight and the quiet hum of the world continuing on without us, I understood something I had never dared to admit. We were both children of the same wound, just shaped differently by it. And for the first time in my life, that didn't make me angry. It made me human. The night settled around us fully, the last traces of sun disappearing. But inside me, something had begun to rise. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the faintest outline of it, like the first light before dawn, too soft to see clearly, too early to trust, but undeniably there. And that was enough for me to take a breath that didn't hurt. We didn't speak again before leaving, but as I walked to my car, I felt a strange sensation at the center of my chest. Something like release, something like loss, something like hope, learning to walk again. A re-encounter that wasn't a reunion, but wasn't a goodbye either, just a beginning. I woke the next morning with a strange stillness in my chest, the kind that doesn't arrive with joy or sorrow, but with something deeper, an awareness that the ground has shifted beneath you, and yet, somehow, you're still standing. The light coming through my bedroom window felt softer than usual, almost diluted, like the world knew I needed gentleness. For years, mornings had been a continuation of responsibility. Emails waiting, problems demanding, expectations pressing. But that morning was different. There was a pause, a breath, a space I didn't recognize. Maybe this is what understanding feels like when it finally comes. Not dramatic, not loud, just clear. I made coffee and sat by the window, watching the steam twist upward like something freed from its own weight. It reminded me of my father's workshop on winter mornings, the way the steam from his mug seemed to rise toward the lamp, as if reaching for warmth. Back then, I thought adulthood was about knowing answers, knowing directions, knowing what to do when people leaned on you. Now I understood adulthood was about learning to carry the consequences of everything you were never taught. It's strange how clarity often arrives after the storm, when everything is quiet, and the only thing left to face is yourself. As I sat there, I let myself think about my brother. Not the man he had been yesterday, but all the versions of him layered beneath. The boy who wanted to keep up, the teenager who wanted to be seen, the young adult who kept chasing validation in all the wrong places. I thought about the mistakes he made, and the mistakes I made too. Not the dramatic ones, but the subtle ones. The ways I distanced myself, the ways I believed silence was protection, the ways I tried so hard to be strong that I forgot strength without softness becomes a wall no one can climb. Understanding isn't forgiveness, but it's the road that leads to it. And that morning I felt myself stepping onto that road for the first time. Later, as I left the house, something unexpected happened. My phone rang. The name on the screen, Andrew, pulled me immediately back to the present. Andrew had worked with me for years, loyal in a quiet way, observant in ways most people weren't. He wouldn't call without reason. "Hey," I answered. His voice came through heavy, like he was holding something he didn't want to say. "We need to talk, it's about your brother." I didn't feel panic, just a slow tightening, like a thread being pulled. "What about him?" There was a long pause. "He's in trouble. Financial trouble." I didn't speak, letting the truth settle. Not because I was shocked, but because something inside me already knew. The desperation in his eyes, the insistence, the anger, it all fit now. "He should have told me," I whispered. Andrew exhaled. He was ashamed. He said you'd think less of him. That sentence hit harder than anything else. Because the truth was painful. He had spent a lifetime believing he was the lesser son, the lesser man. And maybe in ways I never intended, I had contributed to that belief. As I hung up, something inside me shifted again. Not a collapse, but a realignment, a recognition. Understanding was no longer enough. Acceptance was no longer enough. Something needed to change. I drove to his house without calling, letting instinct, not obligation, guide me. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels suspended. His car was in the driveway. The blinds were half drawn. When I knocked, the door opened slowly, revealing him standing there with exhaustion carved into his face. He didn't ask why I came. He didn't pretend to be fine. He just stepped aside and let me enter. The living room was dim, cluttered with unopened envelopes and papers scattered across the table. Bills, notices, warnings, all the things he had tried to outrun. The air felt heavy, thick with unspoken fear. He lowered himself onto the couch. I sat beside him, giving him space, but not distance. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then, quietly, he said, "I didn't want you to see this." "I know," I replied. "I didn't want to become your burden." Those words nearly broke something in me, because all my life I thought the burden was the responsibility placed on me. But now I realized the heavier burden was the belief he carried, that he didn't deserve to be helped. "Listen," I said softly, "you're not a burden. You're my brother." He shook his head, rubbing his palms together. "You don't understand. I messed up. I made mistakes. Everyone does," I interrupted. "You're human, that's all." He looked at me, eyes wet, not with dramatic tears, but with the kind that come from a lifetime of holding everything inside. "I always thought you were perfect," he said, "like you never needed anything." Something warm and painful rose in my chest. "I needed a brother," I whispered. I just didn't know how to say it. Silence filled the room, deep, full, almost sacred. The kind of silence that doesn't divide but binds. Outside, a distant car passed, and the soft hum of its engine felt like the world reminding us it was still there, waiting for us to reshape ourselves. In that quiet, I felt a truth settle over me, gentle but undeniable. I spent my life being strong for everyone else, and somewhere along the way, I forgot that strength isn't meant to isolate, it's meant to connect. Maybe love isn't about carrying someone's weight, but standing with them while they find their footing. And maybe forgiveness isn't something you give, it's something you grow into, slowly, tenderly, like light returning after a long night. I turned to him. We'll fix this. Together. He let out a shaky breath, relief softening the tension in his shoulders. You don't have to. I know, I said, but I want to. A single tear slipped down his cheek, and he didn't wipe it away. And for the first time in years, I felt something real between us. Not obligation, not resentment, but a fragile, emerging brotherhood. Something new, something possible. The room seemed lighter suddenly, the air easier to breathe. It wasn't that the problems had vanished, they were still scattered across the table in envelopes and warnings, but the weight had shifted. It was no longer him against the world, it was us. And standing together, even in brokenness, felt more powerful than anything I had ever carried alone. As I left his house later that night, the sky was a deep, quiet blue, the kind that comes just before dawn. The horizon held the faintest hint of light, soft, pale, almost invisible, but it was there, and for the first time, I felt that same light inside me. Not triumph, not victory, just steady, grounded peace. The kind that comes when you stop fighting the wrong battles and finally start choosing the right ones. I drove home that night with the windows slightly cracked, letting the cool air move through the car like a quiet companion. The streets were nearly empty, the stoplights blinking yellow, stretching long shadows across the pavement. There was a softness in the world that didn't feel accidental. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was the fact that, for the first time in years, I wasn't trying to outrun a storm inside my own chest. Instead, I felt something else. Something settling. Something aligning. When I parked in front of my house and stepped out, the air held that particular chill that comes just before sunrise, when the night hasn't fully surrendered, but the promise of morning is there, faint yet undeniable. I stood there for a moment, listening to nothing but the quiet hum of distant traffic and the steady rhythm of my breath. I don't know if you've ever felt this, that instant when the world goes still enough for you to hear the truth inside your own bones. That moment when you realize life hasn't been waiting for you to be ready, it's been asking you to be honest. Inside my house, everything felt different, even though nothing had changed. The same furniture, the same framed photos, the same walls. But it was like someone had gently rearranged the air. I turned on a small lamp in the living room, and the light spilled across the floor in a warm, amber arc. Soft, grounding, almost like a hand resting on my shoulder. I sat down, letting the quiet fill the room. For years, silence had intimidated me. It felt like an echo of all the things I hadn't dealt with. My father's expectations, my brother's pain, my own exhaustion. But that night, silence didn't feel like something to fix or fill. It felt like an old friend who finally learned how to sit beside me without demanding anything. It reminded me of something. Healing isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It just arrives quietly and waits for you to notice. And as I sat there, I realized something else. I had been waiting my whole life for someone to give me permission to let go, to set down the weight I had been carrying since boyhood. But the only permission I ever needed was my own. It's strange how simple that sounds, strange how long it took me to see it. I stood and walked toward the hallway, the light shifting with each step. I passed the framed photo of my father and me on the day we opened the company. His hand on my shoulder, pride in his eyes, pressure woven invisibly into the space between us. For years, that picture felt like a reminder of responsibility. That night, it felt like a reminder of love. Imperfect, flawed, but love all the same. I touched the frame gently, letting the truth settle in my chest. We all inherit something. Sometimes it's a company. Sometimes it's silence. Sometimes it's a wound that becomes a compass. But what we do with that inheritance, that's the part we get to choose. I walked into my office and opened the drawer where I had placed my father's letters. I held them for a moment, feeling the edges, the folds, the history wrapped inside. They no longer felt like instructions. They felt like closure. Slowly, deliberately, I placed them in a small wooden box, one he had built years ago, and slid it onto the highest shelf. Not to forget, but to honor, to acknowledge that the past had shaped me, but it didn't own me anymore. When I closed the drawer, the sound was soft, almost like an exhale, and for the first time, it didn't echo inside me. It stayed where it belonged, behind me. Later that week, I returned to my brother's house, not to fix him, not to rescue him, but to stand beside him as he sorted through the debris of his mistakes. Bills, overdue notices, the remains of choices made in the dark. We sat on the floor for hours, sorting into piles. What could be saved, what could be negotiated, what needed to be released. There was something almost symbolic about it. Two brothers, rebuilding not just finances, but a relationship. Two men, sweeping through the pieces of their own misunderstandings. At one point he looked at me with tired, honest eyes and said, "I don't deserve this." And I replied, "It's not about deserving, it's about becoming." He didn't respond, but his shoulders eased as if a weight had finally shifted. Sometimes transformation isn't a dramatic breakthrough. Sometimes it's two people sitting on a floor, quietly choosing each other again. When I left his house that evening, the sun was setting in colors I hadn't noticed in years. Deep terracotta, fading lavender, that delicate stretch of pale gold between the two. It made me think of all the sunsets I'd ignored while chasing responsibility. All the mornings I'd missed while trying to be stronger than I actually felt. Life had been happening around me, and I had been too busy carrying the world to notice. Driving home, I rolled down the windows. The wind felt like a cleansing, like something lifting the dust from old memories. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about what I needed to fix. I was thinking about what I needed to feel. By the time I arrived home, night had settled again, the sky deep blue, almost black, dotted with the kind of stars you only notice when you finally slow down. I stood outside for a moment, breathing in the cool air, letting the quiet settle around me like a soft blanket. And then, without overthinking it, I walked inside, closed the door behind me, and felt something shift. I closed it slowly, not out of fear, not out of habit, but out of choice. And for the first time, I didn't fear the silence waiting on the other side. Instead, I welcomed it, because silence, I finally understood, isn't emptiness. It's space. It's clarity. It's the beginning of understanding yourself again. I walked into the living room and lowered myself onto the couch, feeling the weight of the past few weeks settle. Not heavily, but fully, like a coat you finally take off after wearing it too long. Everything that had happened, the letters, the mediation room, the parking lot, the confession, the rebuilding, it all led me here, to this moment, this breath, this version of myself, the man who no longer carries out of obligation, but out of choice, the man who no longer confuses strength with silence, the man who knows forgiveness is a door you open from both sides. I leaned back, letting the stillness wash over me, and realized some stories don't end with triumph. They end with understanding. And sometimes that is the greatest victory of all. And if you're listening to this, if something in this journey touched something in you, I want you to know this. If this story reminded you of someone, or of a part of yourself you left behind, share it in the comments. Sometimes sharing is what heals.